All right. Welcome, everyone. Before I begin, I'd like to just remind everyone to remain muted and to communicate through the chat feature or by raising a virtual hand towards the end if we get time for questions or comments. Okay, and we'll start officially. 4:02. We'll start right now. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the University of Saint Katherine's first forum lecture of our fall semester. I'm David Williams, Assistant Professor of History and Director of the Integrated Interdisciplinary Core and Theology at USK. Our forum lectures, as always, are free and are open to the public, and in the case of the online lectures, are recorded and will be made available on our website, www.usk.edu, in the coming days. If you like the lectures and would like to support the university and its unique mission, you might also like to make a donation at usk.edu/give, and your generosity is greatly appreciated. I'd like to take this opportunity to mention that since our last forum lectures, our Master of Arts in Orthodox Christian Theology has begun. To learn more about that program and other graduate programs, and to apply for them, please follow the link that I'm providing in the chat right now. Our guest lecturer today is Christian Gonzalez. He is the Director of Ministry for Orthodox Youth Ministries, or OYM, a pan-Orthodox youth and young adult ministry agency under the Canonical Assembly of Bishops of the United States. He's a licensed marriage and family therapist who holds multiple degrees from Wheaton College, Azusa Pacific University, and Luther Seminary. Well known for his work developing training materials like Effective Christian Ministry and podcasts like We Are Orthodoxy and Pop Culture Coffee Hour, he is passionate about upbuilding the church as the family of God, a household that forms young people in the likeness of Christ. He lives in Arizona with his beloved wife and 3 daughters. Christian, thank you so much for joining us. And I turn the floor over to you. Thank you very much again for your time, and I look forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you, Deacon David. I am very honored to be with you all this evening. Before we get started, I'd just like to take just a couple moments to be still and to become simply aware of God's presence with us this evening. So I'll just open some space for a little bit of quiet. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Hello, everyone. I'm going to share my screen with you here. This is going to be kind of a fun game. See if it works out. Everybody see this?
You can see it.
Wonderful. Oh, let's see if I can make this full screen. There we go. So to be here, to be able to share just a little bit about perhaps some different takes on ministry that maybe you've heard or maybe not. Perhaps we can even offer a cohesive vision and an approach to ministry, and hopefully to tell you a little bit about how OYM, Orthodox Youth Ministries, the organization that I work for, is a pan-Orthodox youth and young adult ministry agency, the Assembly of Bishops, and how we hope to stand in the gaps and work alongside youth workers and clergy as they seek to more effectively minister to the young people in care. So in the 13 years that I've been working in youth and young adult ministry, the question I get asked more than any other question is this one: how do we keep kids in the church? Of all the things that seems to keep people up at night, this is at the forefront of their minds, and really it's not without good reason. We all know the statistics. We all know people who have left the church, and even the Pew Research Center recently released a report suggesting that if trends continue, within a few decades, less than half the population of America will be Christian. The stakes at this point seem to be quite high when it comes to church engagement, and we can either carry on with the status quo, doing things as we've always done, and continue to see swaths of young people walk out the door, or we can pause and we can reimagine a path that will lead to a reinvigoration of the faith of young people. It's important to recognize, however, that the question that we're asking, how do we keep our kids in the church? How do we keep them from leaving? This isn't a question of theology. It's a question of ministry. What do we have to do to keep young people engaged? It's not simply a matter of what young people believe, but rather how they come to belief that we're asking. In terms of what is believed, the reality is that there's no turning back the dial on secularity in America. But by this, I mean what James K.A. Smith and Charles Taylor mean by secularity, not the religiosity of secularism for these thinkers, for Jamie Smith and Charles Taylor. That war is already over. We've already been secularized. Instead, secularity refers to this current cultural moment that we find ourselves in, where no belief can be taken to be axiomatic, and therefore all beliefs are considered contested and contestable. Secularity, therefore, is not an epidemic of unbelief, but speaks to the contestability of all of these beliefs. So when all beliefs are equally contested, equally contestable, this means that neither doubt nor faith can be taken as universally true. And this leads to what Taylor calls the Nova effect, in which there's an explosion of all these that you're seeing here, these third ways of believing, in which we can doubt while we believe and believe while doubting. See, because even believers are tempted by doubt, but those who don't believe are sometimes haunted maybe by the notion that there perhaps is something more, something beyond. So in a world where there is a plurality of belief and where faith and doubt are no longer seen as antithetical, but rather can be seen as companions to one another, this raises some important questions for those of us in ministry. What is ministry, and what is it for? These questions are ones that we rarely stop to ask ourselves, but that doesn't mean that we don't have answers, ideas, or stories that run in the background of our minds and that shape how we approach ministry. In fact, it might be more true to say this, that unless we stop and ask ourselves these questions, our background assumptions will shape how we approach ministry. Moreover, these background assumptions from stories in our heads about how we measure success in ministry, i.e., what we believe ministry is for, that's going to inform everything. If we have an answer that we believe ministry is for a certain thing, we're going to aim our efforts at that. So I would like to look at some stories that may run in the back of our heads and that frequently guide ministry efforts. And I know all of these because I've done all of them and believed all of these stories at some point in the past. So I speak from personal experience. When I was 24, I spent my first summer working as a camp counselor. I'd been working with the high schoolers at my parish for a few months. At that time, things were going really well. So I figured that I was going to have this down easy. You know, I'd shake some hands, ask some deep questions, and change these kids' lives forever. I told myself that I was going to meet them where they were at. I was going to love them for who they were, that they were going to be gracious and kind to everyone. They were going to listen politely and have deep reflective conversations of the heart, and they were going to levitate when they pray. And everyone would know that Christian Gonzalez was their counselor. Then the reality set in at camp. They were all very smart. They were all very comfortable at camp, and they were incredibly strong-willed. They were often talking when they should have been listening. They were loud, and they definitely did not glow with the light of God. In fact, when it came time for church, they were worse than the 7-year-olds who stood fully at attention in the front of the chapel. They'd complain, they'd lean against the wall, they would say they were too tired, that they were lightheaded, that they needed water, that church was too long. And then the minute church was over, we'd walk outside and they'd start hitting each other with sticks. I was beside myself. Eventually, I just lost it, and I let loose the wrath of God on them, or rather my own wrath. You see, I had great intentions and expectations for how my time at camp was going to go. I went in thinking that we were going to make deep connections and seek God together. What I didn't realize, however, was that I had bought into an implicit belief that the fruit of this ministry was going to be my campers' good behavior. I had believed the story that ministry is for keeping kids good. And I was measuring my own success as a minister on how they behaved. Obviously, there are clear issues here, right? Because I can barely control my own behavior when I'm around a bag of barbecue kettle chips. Success is based on the behavior of others. We're setting ourselves up for deep frustration and an obstacle we just can't overcome. Also, if we're making good behavior the primary thing, then we aren't really preaching a gospel of the kingdom. We're preaching a gospel of sin management. If we buy into a story that ministry is for keeping kids good, we actually end up working against ourselves. Because I don't know about you, but I see myself as a pretty good person. I've never killed anyone, never stolen anything, and never really done anything that would land me in much trouble. So if ministry is all about being good, then wouldn't you say that I'm a pretty successful example of a youth ministry program? And if that's the case, then why would I need to continue going to church or engaging in ministries? I passed the test. So if ministry is just about getting kids to be good, then good kids see that they don't really need to come to church anymore because they've figured it out. Plus, they get to sleep in on Sundays. The bad kids, however, also will not feel the need to go because they won't see it as a place where they belong because it's for good kids. And what's more, they may even realize that the good people at church aren't even really that good themselves. So at best, they're alienated, and at worst, they see the rest of us as hypocrites. No wonder they don't want to come. This isn't all wrong, of course. The Lord does call us to a life of holiness, but it is a holy life that is in response to being called by Christ to follow him. It's not just about keeping rules. It's about following the master. And when we forget this, and we miss out on ministry, and instead choose moralism. So let's move on to the second story that we believe. When I worked for the Greek Orthodox Archdiocese, when I was in Y2AM, my friend Steve and I would visit parishes once a month and lead Be the Bee retreats. They were an excellent time. And since I traveled with Steve, who, some of you may know from his video series, Be the Bee, he was usually surrounded by a gaggle of teen girls, while I stood in the corner near the donuts wondering how many I could eat and still call myself a Christian. Almost always, a parent would approach me and save me from myself by saying, "Hey, you're a Christian, right? Yeah, we really wanted to come yesterday, but Yanni had a soccer game, so we couldn't do it. Did it go well?" And when I would say that it indeed had gone well, the words out of their mouth were predictable. "Great. How many people came?" It's an understandable question after all, because we're under the idea that the more people who attend something, the more successful the event is. Moreover, we especially apply this metric to what we consider the real events of ministry, like attending soup kitchens or service to the poor. In fact, I remember one event that I had tried to organize as a trip to serve the homeless, and 3 young people showed up. And when I saw this small group, I said words that I'll forever regret. Where is everyone? The message here was that these young people were not enough, that somehow there needed to be more people present for the event to be worthwhile. But if this is the case, then what would that mean for Christ's transfiguration? I mean, only 3 of his youth group were present at that time. Does that mean that this event didn't have universal significance? Obviously, we can see the trap that we fall into here, that believing that ministry is for keeping kids active, particularly in service-oriented things. But when we look at numbers as the measure of success, we run into problems really quickly. After all, just because a lot of people go to something doesn't mean that it's a good thing. Justin Bieber has a lot of fans. ISIS is really good at recruiting and radicalizing people. Obviously, we wouldn't ever want to encourage people to do ISIS as good ministry, much less go to a Justin Bieber concert. And just because something is sparsely attended doesn't mean that it's bad. And we want our young people to come to events, that we want people to show up, and it's understandable that we would like to have a concrete metric of success, these numbers. But the reality is that being driven by keeping as many people active as possible isn't ministry. It's activism. So now let's look at the third and final story that can capture our imagination about ministry. When I was in Antioch, when I worked in Antioch in California, as youth director, way back in 2011, I met with parish youth workers on a regular basis, and one in particular expressed this to me. He said, "Man, I just don't know what to do with our kids. They just don't have the right information about orthodoxy. They don't know anything about saints. They don't know anything about the councils. They don't even know where Genesis is in the Bible. I'm concerned that if we don't teach these kids about the faith, then they're going to fall away from the church in college." And I get this. I have taught Sunday school several times throughout my life, including right now. But in the past, I was really drawn to the idea that there was something that kids needed to get, something they needed to understand in their minds. Since I converted in high school to Orthodoxy, I believed that if they just knew what the Orthodox Church believed, then this would be good enough to stand against the forces of secularism and against other religions. Like if they understood what the church teaches, then everything would be all good. The problem, however, is that Christians believe some kind of wacky stuff. That a cosmic being that we call God made everything in the world, including human beings. And he made two of them, but told them not to eat a piece of fruit. Otherwise, they'd be punished and die. But did that stop them? No. And so then God sent them into the world where they have to struggle and have pain in childbirth and die. But because God loves people, he didn't like that. And so he sent his own son to be born as a person, but like through a virgin. And then he grew up as a person 2,000 years ago when he taught and walked on top of water. And then he died on a cross like a criminal. And then he came back from the dead and he flew up into heaven. And one day he's going to come back and he's going to judge everyone. I mean, on their face value, these are some pretty wacky things to believe. Unless you know God, unless you've met God, unless you've encountered Christ, then, well, suddenly it's like, yeah, of course, all of that happened. And as my patron Saint Andrew, the first called, put it, if you wish to understand, become his disciple. Unfortunately, when we approach ministry, as my youth friend did, we fall into the narrative of believing that ministry is ultimately simply for keeping kids orthodox, that we have to give them the right information in youth group or Bible study, and the church becomes simply a technology that passes on the right information to people. And the metric of the success, in other words, is kids in pews. But we have to ask ourselves, is this what ministry really is for? Just to keep kids in pews? It seems to me that the answer is no. This isn't ministry. This is traditionalism. If the end goal is simply to keep kids orthodox using information and teaching them orthodox perspectives, then what do we do when suddenly the scientific story starts making a lot more sense? What do we do when they learn about carbon dating and evolutionary biology? When we use Western techniques of educating the mind to educate Western minds with Eastern thought, when they encounter Western education that makes sense, we hardly stand a chance. So this puts us in a precarious situation. If ministries that we've been devoting ourselves to have been oriented toward these ends, towards moralism, activism, or traditionalism, we're in kind of dicey water. And I want to be clear here, it's not bad to want people to be good or active or orthodox. The question, however, is whether or not these things are actually the full measure of ministry. Can't someone be good without being Christian? Can't someone be active without being a Christian? Can't someone be orthodox without being a Christian? Obviously, I think the answer is sadly in the affirmative. So ministry that, as God intends, must be about something else. It must lead to something else. And so we must ask, so what is ministry for? How does God view ministry? How does God do ministry? Fortunately for us, God, in his wisdom, lays it out right at the beginning. In Genesis 1, as we see God lay forth his plans for humanity, this is especially important because we need to recognize, as youth ministry scholar and theologian Andrew Root says, that God himself is the first minister to mankind. Therefore, we might even be able to say that ministry itself is God's own work. It's what God does. It's how God acts. And we see this in Jesus, who comes primarily as a healer. And drawing on the work of Father John Bear in Genesis 1:26, we see exactly what this ministry of God is, what this work of God is. When God says, let us make humankind in our image after our likeness. That's it. That is the ministry of God. That is the work of God, to make human beings like himself. In short, God is minister, and ministry is therefore what God does. What God does is making human beings like himself. Ministry, therefore, is for making human beings like God. Nothing more, nothing less. God's metric for success in ministry is a God likeness. That's it. As ministers, then, our role is to participate in God's work in the lives of youth and young adults. In fact, this actually is just ministry with anyone, simply by opening space for God to act and by participating in this work of God to make human beings like himself. And unless we keep this story of what ministry is for front and center in our minds, we're easily tempted by all kinds of other stories that will too easily draw us away from the center of God's own story that he's trying to write in the lives of young people, and of all people, for that matter. So while this may be a bit of a no-brainer that God's work is a deification of, it's easy to be excited about our current ministry in this time, which is solely reliant on youth programs, fun events, Sunday school, and other kinds of educative processes. We want to build good youth programs that compete with the evangelicals down the road. We want our kids to come to our stuff instead of theirs, to come to our youth groups and Bible studies instead of theirs. And again, while all of this is understandable, we need to do a little bit of a reality and humility check when it comes to the question of how we do ministry. I think a lot of us are all too familiar with this timeline of the history of the Orthodox Church. In this beautiful little line, we see the entirety of the Orthodox Church's history represented a 2,000-year-old, beautiful, rich, powerful tradition that has transformed sinners into saints. But let's look at it realistically. Our current models of ministry with young people, as I said, are heavily reliant on things like Sunday school. But for a moment, let's consider that the first Sunday school didn't even exist until 1780, when William Rake started the first one in Gloucester, England, quickly followed by William Elliot in 1975, when he opened the first North American school in Virginia. To put things even more in perspective, it wasn't until 1958 that Goya, the Greek Orthodox Youth of America, and 1969 that SOYO, the Society of Youth Organizations, were established in North America. So again, when we look at this long timeline, let's be clear. The 2,000-year-old church went nearly 1,800 years before Sunday school was created, and almost 2,000 years before Orthodox youth ministries were created. This doesn't seem insignificant to me. As a church that loves roots, it makes me wonder why we've become so heavily dependent on models of ministry that are at best 200 years old. I mean, put in numbers, that means that we're neglecting 90% of the history of our spiritual formation practices, while also trying to shove that 90% of formation into models that have been developed in the last 200 years, or sometimes even within the last 60. Perhaps we need to reevaluate our approach and consider what it might mean to do ministry God's way. This then leads us to the question of how does God do ministry? How does God enact ministry with human beings throughout time? I believe that there's a very simple pattern that we see from God throughout the ages, one that we seem to have forgotten in our contemporary approaches to ministry. Like everything else in Orthodoxy, this path is threefold. It consists of three basic steps that God has used since the beginning to form people in his likeness. One, by moving to encounter his people. Two, by inviting them to embody his church, to be his presence on earth. And three, by calling them to engage the world in his name. That is the plan. That is the path. It involves encountering God, embodying his church, and engaging the world in his name. Indeed, it is these three E's that form the bedrock of OYM and everything that OYM's work will aim to do. My contention is that if we are not aiming to lead young people toward one of these three E's, an encounter with God, helping them embody his kingdom, and helping them engage the world in his name, then we might be missing the mark on ministry and settling for a lesser story, and frankly, one that's less interesting. Over and over again throughout our 2,000-year history, we see that this is how God forms people in his likeness, by encountering them in his Christ, by inviting them to embody his presence, and then to engage the world in his name. So I'm not so much introducing a new way of doing ministry, as much as I'm suggesting we need to return to the way that it's been done since the beginning. After all, for nearly 1,800 years, the church has found ways to make saints without the help of Sunday school, and we need to wonder what precisely they did to do so. If the church made saints for nearly 2,000 years before the inception of Goya and Soyo, then we must ask, what precisely was the program for youth to become people of God? Our simple answer is to say that they were part of the liturgical sacramental life of the church, and I don't think that this is wrong, but I do think that it's an incomplete vision of precisely what the work of God in the lives of his saints has been in and through the liturgical, ascetical, and sacramental life of the church. Simply encouraging young people to come back to church doesn't really do the trick. We've seen this through the story of ministry being orthodoxy. Instead, we must ask, what are the things that are more deeply at play in the lives of God's holy ones throughout the ages? If we're going to tell young people that their calling is to become saints, then we have to ask the question, how did the saints become saints? To answer this question, again, let's look back at Adam and Eve's creation and see if we can find this threefold pattern in its fullness. In Genesis 1:26, again, we see God's intention to make human beings like himself. But what we see before this is God's beautiful creation of the Temple of Eden. And it is in this temple that God decides he's going to place his own idol, his own image, his own presence as the ruler of it and as the emissary of his presence in creation. But let's look more precisely at this. In Genesis chapter 2, we see this. In verse 7, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life. Man became. I want you to imagine that someone walks up to you and decides to breathe into your nose. Imagine the closeness that comes with this. This is an intimate moment between Adam and God. God, with his own hands, takes dust and forms Adam. This is nothing less than a moment of encounter between God and man. And if this weren't enough, then we see that God breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. Imagine how close he had to be. This is an intimate encounter, a close encounter of the God kind. God's involvement in the creation of humanity is deeply intimate, and as here we see the first encounter of God with humanity is to take humanity in his hands and to breathe into his nostrils. Similarly here, God shares his own life with man through this breath, giving him the breath of life, giving him God's very own life. And so in verse 8, we see the fulfillment of this, where God places Adam in the garden as the embodiment of his own presence, as God's image in the garden. No task has been given yet, but we see that Adam's presence there is to be as God's own presence, to embody God in the temple of creation. In the verses that follow, we see that Adam is given the charge to till the earth and to keep it, and he is entrusted with the naming of the animals, a creative endeavor that God could have done himself. However, Adam is given the job of engaging the world as a gardener in God's own place. God's invitation to Adam is to engage the world as a co-creator. And like God, Adam uses words to name the animals, mirroring God's own way of creation, doing so as a participant in the world that God has created. Here he calls Adam to engage the world in his name. From the beginning, this has been the path toward God-likeness. Even when Adam and Eve fall, we see that God then comes walking in the cool of the garden to meet them. This is another moment of encounter, a moment that could have been an encounter, embody, engage cycle. However, Adam and Eve are not interested in the encounter, and so they hide, and then they turn against one another. Had they been willing to be seen and known by God, who knows how the story would have gone. However, it's just not what we see, and so they fail. And we see Israel encounter God in deep ways, only to fail to embody his presence and to engage the world in his name over and over again. But then we meet the Virgin Mary, who is encountered by God's own messenger, Gabriel, the one who bears God's own words. And she is told that she will literally embody the presence of God in the world, literally. And she gives birth, engaging in the world in God's name, fulfilling her calling to bring forth this embodiment of God's love in the world so that he might be encountered by others. This is the cycle, an encounter that leads to an embodiment of Christ, which leads to an engaging the world in his name, which leads to an embodiment of Christ's love in the world, which leads to an encounter for other people. This is the cycle. St. Paul has this encounter on the road to Damascus, and he is sent to a street called Straight, where he meets Ananias, who baptizes him, incorporating him, literally embodying him into the larger community of the church, from which he is sent forth as an apostle and a missionary, an embodiment of God's love in the world to bring Christ to others so that you can say things like, imitate me as I imitate Christ. Saint Hermolaos was a humble priest when he met the young Pantaleon, a child of a pagan father and a Christian mother. Hermolaos met with Pantaleon and taught him Christ, embodying Christ's presence for Pantaleon. Pantaleon, a medical student, realizes that he believes in Christ because of this friendship with Hermolaos, who embodied for him Christ's presence, which became an encounter for Pantaleon. As Pantaleon is baptized, he takes on the name Pantaleimon, which means the all-merciful, quite explicitly, once again, embodying the presence of Christ in the world. After which, he gives away his medical healing expertise for free, thereby engaging the world in Christ's name. After being executed, those who witnessed it, including Pantaleimon's own executioner, convert to Christ because Pantaleimon had so embodied Christ's presence that his martyrdom was an encounter with Christ for those who witnessed it, leading them to join the body of Christ's believers, to embody Christ's presence in their own lives, and then to engage the world further in his name. Over and over and over and over again, we see that Christ's saints are not formed through a youth program, but through a three-step process of encountering Christ, whether it's through being approached by an angel, or being knocked off their horse, or being met in the person of a priest, by embodying his church, by learning where they belong, where they fit, where they have a place that is theirs and a community that's theirs, and by engaging the world in his name, by seeing that their lives have purpose, meaning, and that there is a call that they have been given to make this world better. It is through an encounter with Christ, being invited to embody his church, and being called to engage the world in his name, that the saints of God have all been formed throughout the 2,000-year history of the church. And a lot of this happened without Sunday school or youth group. So why? Why are we so wed to current models of ministry when it neglects the ancient wisdom of the church and the perennial path of the saints toward godlikeness? Perhaps the questions that we must ask instead of how we keep kids in the church are these. How do we foster an encounter with Christ? How do we invite young people to be a part of his body, his family? How do we commission them to serve the Lord in the world? Fuller Youth Institute recently released a book called 3 Big Questions That Change Every Teenager. And those questions are these. Who am I? Where do I belong? How can I make a difference? In this, I believe we see the quest for encounter, embodiment, and engagement. The first question of identity, who am I, is answered through encounter. You are God's beloved child, and he's come to you. You are the one that God sought. Where do I belong? This is answered through the invitation to embody his church, to belong to the community of saints and holy ones throughout the ages. You are a member of his body, of this body. You have a role to play. You are a son or a daughter of God, and you belong in his family. And how can I make a difference? This is answered through the call to engage the world in his name, to bring about God's kingdom justice everywhere. These questions are the questions that young people are asking are answered not through innovation, but by remembering who we are as this ancient faith. OIM, thus, is the youth and young adult ministry agency created to bring this vision of ministry to the church at large. Everything we do is committed to these 3 E's, helping youth workers pass on a faith where every young person can encounter Christ, embody his church, and engage the world in his name. We aren't trying to do anything new, but simply to return to the way that things have been done throughout the ages in the formation of the saints of God. I appreciate all of you listening to me. I look forward to any questions you may have. And I implore you, remember who you are as God's beloved children.
Christian, thank you so very much. We could do a virtual round of applause if you'd like. I am so touched and surprised in a very good way by your extraordinary vision for ministry. And I so appreciate your stress on encounter, engagement, and embodiment, particularly because it's through encounter with the divine that genuine conviction, conversion, and Christian life is possible. And without encounter, engagement, embodiment, the Christian life, and I think, you know, one of the pitfalls of ministry has been and continues to be that it's simply academic. I really, you know, you said that it may seem simplistic, but, you know, the way you talked about ministry, our goal of ministry being, or the primary goal of ministry being, to make people like God. This theosis, right? The divinization of humankind. It's an extension of the sacramental life of the church, not as something separate. And I think that very often we see ministry or Sunday school or something like that. There's something that takes place outside of what we consider church to be. Sometimes even, for example, you know, the young people will leave the church while the liturgy is happening. I think this is an example of that kind of dichotomy. We separate these two things. Also, I really want to applaud your honesty, because when you mentioned, you know, you allude essentially to very often we demand by our lack of formation of youth that they commit intellectual suicide, essentially, as soon as they encounter a narrative, be it in university or wherever else, it seems to be quite convincing and not quite as wacky, right, as perhaps some of the stories, the biblical stories, they've been told as a young person with no kind of context, no kind of deeper understanding of those meanings. I could say a lot. I think that hopefully we've got some good questions among us. You can go ahead and raise a hand, but thank you so much, Christian. That was absolutely fantastic. Fantastic.
Thank God. Thanks for inviting me.
So let's see. Who's got a question or a comment for Christian? Hillary, go ahead. Go ahead, Hillary. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question for you, Christian, and thank you so much for your
Thank
talk.
you. Thank you for being here.
I think I'm definitely guilty of all of the above. Wanting kids to be good and do community service and so on, because we taught them well, right?
Yes.
A difference I see between my husband, who is cradle Orthodox and grew up in a very ancient, physically ancient church, is he and everybody from his community was very aware that the church and the courtyard and the hall and everything belonged to them as a community. Priests came and went, but they always belonged. What I see from my children, who are of course in touch with all their neighbors, is very often now churches of all denominations are very identified with the personality of the priest or pastor. And if the child doesn't get along with that person, they feel then immediately they don't belong. And if they're my children, they become very judgy. I guess if I would be interested if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I want to just thank you for saying any of that, because I do think that that's a real thing that happens. I think we've kind of, in the light of things like Instagram and social media influencers and just the stuff that we see more and more in the news and like evangelical world, especially with like celebrity pastors who have falls from grace and things like this. It's, we do kind of have a fascination with celebrity, and I think it's really harmful to us, because we stake so much on this one person who carries so much weight in our lives, which is not to say that we shouldn't have guidance or anything like that, but to elevate somebody to the level of celebrity can be really, really detrimental. So I do think that there's something to be said about, the role of the priest or pastor or whoever really being a relational force in the community, for sure. Because I think that sometimes we kind of put them up there and we listen to what they say and we talk about whether we like the sermon or not. And we kind of, that's the interfacing that we have with our priests and pastors for the most part. But I do feel like it's hard to shepherd a flock you don't know. It's hard to, think about Jesus, right? He says, I call my sheep by name and they know my voice. And his relationship with his sheep is incredibly intimate. And I think that dynamic is one that probably we need to reclaim as a community. We've done a really good job of coming up with ministries and organizations. We kind of have them all siloed. You got the ladies group, you got the men's group, you got the elders group, you got the single elders group, you got the single elders with diabetes group. We've got like all the different just kinds of demographics that we're like trying to reach, but never do they really intersect. And so there's no opportunity for relationship to occur. And, again and again, you see that the relational space is where God acts and where God moves. Again, he sends his angel to Mary. The Pantaleimon was in a relationship with Hermeleos, and you see all throughout, and this is the church's idea of the spiritual father, right? That which doesn't necessarily mean priest, by the way. We have this idea of eldership being a gift. And I think that the more we kind of can claim eldership in the church as something that belongs to the community, we might be moving the right direction. But I do think that relational space is something we need to do better at. And I would say that the big thing that probably we need to learn how to do to make that better first is just to listen to one another. People do not know how to listen anymore. Everyone wants to talk, and share their opinions. And we get like so many arguments these days. It's like, oh my gosh, like I have to hear one more thing about a thing. It's like, it's just heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking to see what's happened in the last couple of years. But yeah, I agree. We need to find some way of moving out of the celebrity pastorship and into a real family of God.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Christian, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to forgive me in advance for this long-winded question, for such a simple question. But I had to preface this by saying that your example, Christian, of that first example, when engaging when you were a camp counselor, it was special to me because I was one of those 7-year-olds in the front row. And so seeing all those guys that you were, and now I know very well, those guys that were, I'm sure, giving you a hard time. It was special to me because I was one of those 7-year-olds who was standing at the front, who was given this open invitation to go and join the singers at the front. And it was that put me on my path to where I am now. And so while I hardly know you personally, I do credit you with a lot of who I am today. And it's because of that call that you were talking about, embodying Christ. And, we 7-year-olds, when Christian Gonzalez was at camp, he was everything. He was larger than life. And so my question simply is, what does that call look like in today's world, especially for OYM? What does it look like to enter into youth today, to speak generally? What does it look like to enter into their space? In my mind, I'm picturing even how Christ entered our space, taking on who we were, but yet remaining who he was. How do we as youth ministers go into those spaces and engage with youth where they are today?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And Christian, it's really good to see you. I saw your name pop up and I was instantly pleased. And I'm humbled by your words for sure, and definitely a little embarrassed by them. So yeah, I mean, I think that's the big question, is what does it look like? And I think it's hard in some ways when we talk about how do we enter into the lives of youth, because that's a big group of people. Like it's a very large group. But I think the way that we enter into the lives of persons is that relational space. I think that we've been heavily reliant on models of ministry that are highly programmatic. Come to this thing, do this thing, have this talk, read this book, all of that kind of stuff. But when you look at how Jesus does ministry, how he does discipleship, is he takes walks with people. He has dinner with them. He invites himself over to their house. He tells them to quit their jobs. There's like a lot of really interesting personal interactions that Jesus has with people that I don't think that we do all the time, right? Like we invite people to big events where they maybe feel nameless and alone. We kind of advertise those events as being successful based on how many people came to them. And my feeling is, like if we have a youth group of 12 kids and one of them wants to kill us, then like we're doing about as good as Jesus did at some points in his ministry. It's a joke, because Judas. But the thing is, like, I think that the way we have to enter into the space in the lives of young persons, it has to be like, unique and by name. And alongside of that, then we can kind of, I think, stand alongside young people and be people who just point fingers at stuff. Like I think that's like what the best teachers do. They're like, have you looked at this? Have you seen this way? We've done it. I think also kind of the way we tend to think about church and liturgy and all of this stuff is we think about it almost as like we think about church as like God's house, right? Like that's where God lives. God lives in church, and he's even more localized sometimes into like into the bread and the wine. And then like we go get our bread and our wine, and then we go about our lives kind of hoping that it does some sort of magic on us or something and makes our lives better. But my feeling is like, what if we could actually walk alongside young people and begin to show them how the church is deeply reflective of the truest realities? Because if you look around in the church, so you see all kinds of stuff, right? I mean, look up and you see in the dome, depending on your church, there's Jesus up there, and the church stretches out as his entire body, and inside of that is people, fire, water. We see smoke in the air. We see the elements of earth on the table. So we see fire, water, wind, and air, or wind and earth. That's like all of creation in the medieval mind, right? Those four elements of medieval creation. And we see that all of those are held within Christ and therefore become vehicles and sacraments to engaging and encountering him. The better way to maybe think about it is sometimes we think of the world as being like the stage upon which God acts, right? Like there's the world, and then God kind of breaks in every now and then and like does some stuff. And isn't that cool when he parted the Red Sea? And wasn't it great when whatever? As opposed to if we were to consider God's love like the ocean, it's just this big body of water, it's an imperfect metaphor, right? Because God's boundless and even the ocean has its ends. But let's say that God's love and God's presence is the ocean. And if we were to take a sponge, and that represents all of creation, and put that sponge in the ocean, where would the water be? Inside or outside the sponge? I mean, the answer is just as yes, right? Like it's everywhere present and filling all things. And so we inhabit this world that is soaked in Christ. just dripping in the love of God. And yet, how often do we engage the world not that way? Like, we would never walk into church and throw our garbage on the ground, right? We would never do that. We would never go spit in the face of an icon. Yet how often do we deride our brothers and sisters and say bad things about them, or spit in their face on the internet, or say something really, mean somehow, or think mean thoughts about them? How often do we just kind of like leave our stuff on the floor and figure someone else will get it? All of these things, if we let the liturgy be, it can be instructive for us as to how we are to see and contemplate the reality of God's presence as everywhere present and filling all things. What a world that would be, to exist in a way that was Christ. So I think of Saint Silouan. Once he was taking a walk with Saint Sophrony, and Saint Sophrony hit a blade of grass out of the way. And Silouan was just like, dude, what did that grass do to you? Like, he had this sense of the holiness of the grass and as it being a thing of God's. And it just, like, it broke his heart that Sophrony hit this grass. And that was a moment for Sophrony to kind of like come to Jesus a little bit, So I think it's a good question. I think it's a big task, but my two kind of long-winded answers to your long-winded question, which wasn't terribly long-winded, is we need to walk alongside people and point out the way. Point it out. Look for Christ in everything. We'll play a game with our kids sometimes where we'll say, like, how is God like a palm tree? And then the world becomes just like filled with mystery that reveals God. Everything becomes an icon then. What a world. What a world that could be. Hope that helps. Hope that answers something.
Thank you, Christians, very much for that. We may have time for one more quick question. So if anyone wants to be brave, you can raise the virtual hand, or else. Nope. Okay, well, look, I just wanted to again extend not just my personal thanks, but on behalf of the whole university, Christian, thank you very much for spending your time with us, for your fantastic presentation and for your very thoughtful answers. It's deeply appreciated. So as is for every forum lecture, this lecture, which has been recorded, will eventually be placed on the website, where there'll be an archive of previous forum lectures, and then those that will be coming up in the remainder of the semester and on. The next forum lecture that we have will be on Friday, October the 14th, and it is entitled, Does Orthodoxy Need Psychology?, which is a presentation by Dr. Stephen John Harris. And I encourage you all to come back again, and to invite friends or any interested parties as well. I think this is actually a record turnout. I can see 73 participants here. So that's a wonderful thing. It's a great way to start this collection of forum lectures for the fall semester. And if I can just ask you all, just very briefly, to unmute yourselves, please, and give a round of applause to our speaker as a show of appreciation. Make as much noise as possible.
Thank you. So
Okay. Thank you.
Nice.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you again, Christian. We'll want to keep in close touch with you and hopefully collaborate on some things. Best of luck, and you're in our prayers, as is the Orthodox Youth Ministries. God bless you. God bless everyone. Have a good weekend, and we'll see you all very soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.
Christian, that was so good. My goodness me. Oh,
Thank
so-
God.